All right. Now I think I've set this up correctly. I am starting something a little bit new for the channel, something totally new for the channel. We haven't done a live stream or a podcast or anything like that in a while, but the exciting thing is that there's a government shutdown here in the US, and it's given me the idea to take a little bit of the time that I am not working at the moment to talk about game design. So I'm going to dive in, talk about game design from a few various perspectives, and hopefully this is broadcasting to the world. And if you are joining us live, fantastic. Jump in the chat, leave a comment, tell us some exciting things that you've got going on. If you are, not live and you're watching this after the fact, I hope it's useful. So anyway, that's a lot of preamble to say, who am I, right? I'm Josh Heath. I am one of the officers within High Level Games. I am the Chief Operations Officer here. I produce games, I publish them, I write them, I edit them, I do layout work, and I don't know that I'm an expert at any of these things, right? I just do them. I've been working in the game industry for about 9 years now, depending on how you define the industry and time. But I have a lot of experience as a gamer, right? I've been playing games for, let's say, 30 years ish. I've been running games for nearly as long, and while I haven't played every game that's out there, because there are a large amount of tabletop role-playing games, and there are a lot of board games out there in the world, I have played quite a few tabletop role-playing games specifically, and that's what I'm going to be talking about during these streams, is tabletop role-playing games. So what do I mean by a tabletop role-playing game? I mean something like Dungeons and Dragons, something like Apocalypse World, something like Vampire the Masquerade. These are all examples of tabletop role-playing games, right? With Dungeons and Dragons absolutely being the most popular slash the most well-known, right? I don't know, in my experience at Dungeons and Dragons, D&D is the best RPG. I don't believe that to be true. I think it is a fine role-playing game for what it does, though. And so from that perspective, I definitely think starting with D&D is not a bad call, right? Starting with D&D as a general way of getting your feet wet in both game design and or as a player is a fantastic place to start, right? There are people who are like, no, that will ruin you for gaming forever, and I personally don't believe that to be true, right? I don't think anything can ruin you for gaming, right? You can come into the industry, the hobby, in a million different ways. But let's talk about mechanics, because mechanics is where I wanted to start. And what do I mean by mechanics? So a mechanic is an action that you take either in the fiction of the world or in the player mindset of the game that causes an effect to occur in the game itself, which is a really broad, that's an incredibly broad statement about what mechanics are. And I start broad because mechanics are a broad concept, right? They are not simply dice rolls, right? Frequently, when people talk about mechanics, they are talking about a element of the game that requires either a dice roll or other randomizers. Other randomizers can be cards, they can be a computerized randomization system, they can be a million different things. Rock, paper, scissors is a randomizer, right? There are a million different things that are considered randomizers that are not mechanics. But they are mechanics, I should say, right? But a mechanic is not necessarily a randomizer. Hopefully that makes some level of sense, even though I said it incorrectly. So a mechanic is a thing that you as a player, almost always, that you as a player, or you as a game master, or you as a person involved in the game, make a choice about, and that causes an effect in the fiction of the story, right? So let's start with Dungeons and Dragons as an example of a mechanic, right? Rolling a d20, rolling a 20-sided die is a type of mechanic. I mentioned a minute ago, that's a randomizer, right? A randomizer is a type of mechanic done to simulate the possibility of failure in the real world, right? So players often, they don't have to, but to simulate the difficulties of a world, randomizers allow you to simulate failure, the possibility of failure, but also the possibility of extreme success, right? So these are some balances that you have with a randomizer. So randomizers, let's talk about randomizers as a mechanic, because I think I'm starting there, and then we can dive deeper into other elements of mechanics, right? So a randomizer is designed for those two things, right? To offer the possibility of failure and to offer the possibility of extreme success in some form. And over the years, there have been numerous types of randomizers. The 20-sided die is the most common randomizer known to most players and most game designers because of Dungeons and Dragons, right? They used early on a 20-sided randomizer because it was big enough and it was possible to get a dice that was that size, but it was big enough to offer some variability, right? A D6 or a 6-sided die is also a very common randomizer. Now, if you use a single 6-sided die, you have 6 possible results. If you have a 20-sided die, you have 20 possible results. I am not a mathematician. Mathematicians may argue with the way I described that, but I think I get the basic gist, right? That offers some variability and some additional specificity in the impact of your roll, right? A deck of cards, an average deck of cards, playing cards, is 52 cards, right? As a randomizer, that gives you 52 possible outcomes if you draw straight from a pack of playing cards, not counting jokers, right? That would add 2 to 4 more potential options for effects or outcomes on the card draw. Rock, paper, scissors is more complicated mathematically. You would assume it would have 1 in 3 possible outcomes. It does not, right? And I'm not going to get into the math because, again, I'm not a mathematician, but rock, paper, scissors has more. And then, of course, you have the impact of people in a rock, paper, scissors, right? Randomizers are designed to be neutral. Randomizers as a mechanic being neutral means that they are not something you are directly, as a human, supposed to be causing the effect of, right? So with randomizers, that's frequently why they are one of the major mechanics in a game, because they offer somewhat of a neutral sense of the world just does things, right? Rocks might fall. We might trip. People might, a rope might break, right? We don't have great ways of invoking the variability of things we cannot see in the real world without randomizers. And as a mechanic, that's why they're frequently in a game. And you can do a lot of different things with randomizers, right? There are multiple different ways to build a randomizer depending on what you're trying to simulate, right? A D20 simulates a large amount of variability. Players often complain about swinginess in those outcomes, right? Because you have 20 possible outcomes on a D20, that means there will be some significant variability on your success or failure with that randomizer. So you might so you have D20s as a common randomizer. You also have 2D6 as a common randomizer. You have D10s, 10-sided dice either as percentile, 1 out of 100, or you have D10s that are 1 to 10 as also a common randomizer. And again, these randomizers can be built different ways. You can build your game around your randomizer in various different fashions. Some of the more common ones are dice pools. A dice pool simulates that you have a certain amount of capacity or skill at a thing, and you add dice to represent the increasing skill that you have with whatever that thing is. Again, there are way too many ways to talk about how to build a dice pool, but one great example is Shadowrun. In Shadowrun, you have specific stats. Those stats give you a certain amount of d6s that you roll. And then on that d6 roll, if you have a 5 or a 6, that counts as a success. I actually don't remember if that's true in Shadowrun or if it's a different metric for what's successful or what's not. But there are two things in there, right? The dice pool represents your ability, your skill, your background in using that mechanic, right? And using that attribute and using that skill, whatever it is that you're doing. The more dice you have, the more opportunity you have for success because you are skilled in that thing, right? A dice pool can also have variability in what is considered a success, right? Randomizers give you lots of different ways of building what is considered a success and what is not considered a success. And this really quickly gets into math, right? But if you say, hey, a roll on a d6 of a 4, 5, or 6 is a success, that means you have a higher percentage of success chance with rolling more dice because you are more likely to get a 4, 5, or 6 as a result on those dice. You can also set difficulty in different ways, right? You can say you have to have X amount of successes to succeed at a particular activity. And this is quickly complicated, right? It quickly becomes whether or not that's good math to do or bad math to do. Ultimately, it is a lot down to feel, though. My experience, my suggestion to you as a designer is, yes, have a mathematician take a look at your basic mechanic if you think it's really complicated. But if you go with what feels good at the table, if you go with what feels good as a player interacting with the world that you are building, with the mechanics that you are building, is often a better direction to go. And particularly with dice, right? Particularly with dice, you're trying to get a specific feel at the table. A d20, a roll of 20, a natural 20 on a d20 feels amazing at the table, right? Every D&D player rides the high of a d20. They'll tell you, everyone that has played for more than a few sessions, that has rolled a d20, has a story about that critical success, right? That moment feels powerful. It feels awesome. As long as the GM is effectively using that dice roll in the story. That is a different conversation. We'll be talking about game mastering in the future, but we've talked a lot about randomizers. I could probably talk about dice and randomizers all day long. They are the most common mechanic, but they are not the only mechanic, right? There are tons of other mechanics out there, and they can be randomizers. They can be lots of other things. What do I mean, right? What are other things that count as a mechanic? A specific action that you take in character with out of character adjudication can be a mechanic. So Amber Diceless Role-Playing is an amazing example of a game that has no dice, right? It has no randomizers, in theory. It has instead a series of systems of identifying who is the best at a series of different things. And the person in a scenario who is the best at a thing will always win. They will always find a way to succeed over the other characters in the story, unless that other character is better at something else that they bring into the story, right? This is a mechanic. Building your characters in this way where you create a system of who's the best, who's second best, etc., all the way down the way, is a mechanic, right? That sets up the scenario of determining who could potentially be the winner of a scenario. A mechanic can also be something like a spell in a game, right? A character, a wizard, might have a specific spell. The spell itself is not necessarily a mechanic, right? The spell is the story about the mechanic. Hello there, whoever has joined us. A spell is the fiction that the mechanic is built around, right? Like, I cast a spell, and that spell then has a mechanical system. It tells you what the effect of the spell is on the world, if there are any randomizers that need to be rolled to determine some level of success with that mechanic, and then they tell you, they encourage an outcome, right? There's a description of what happens when you cast a spell, right? And the spell itself is the framing for that mechanic. Let me pivot to a different, similar sort of description. In the Trinity Continuum, in most superhero games that I've played, that I've run, they use a set of mechanics for powers, for superpowers, that you can skin in different ways. And when I say skin, I mean you can describe them in different ways. So, for example, a superhero game has a mechanic of flight, and it gives you some descriptions. This is how much resource this flight power needs to be used. This is how fast you can go. These things. These are all flavorings, right, to this idea of flight as a mechanic, right? And then you can say, I, as a player, am the Silver Surfer, right? Just watched Fantastic Four First Steps last night, the other night, 2 nights ago now. Loved it. Fantastic movie. No pun intended. And the Silver Surfer has flight, right? The Silver Surfer is on a surfboard, right? Flying through the space and air. But flight can also be wings, right? The important part is flight is the mechanic, right? Flight is the thing that happens both in the story, and it is the out of game mechanic that you are saying my character is capable of taking this action, right? I feel like I've gone in wildly different directions in kind of talking about this. A mechanic can also be something like a move empowered by the apocalypse. So a move empowered by the apocalypse is a thing that you as a character are trying to do, or it is a thing you as a player are trying to demonstrate your character is doing. And this is one of those interesting spaces for mechanics, right? Mechanics require player decision, but you can also, through a scene of your character acting, speaking, and being involved in the fiction, a mechanic may naturally occur as the outcome that should happen, right? For example, a player in my May I Enter a Vampire game might use the move Act with Intent. Act with Intent is a move that's really vague. It says you are doing something with intent in the scene, right? So you as a player might say, I'm going to run up the side of that building, trying to get my hand in the screen to demonstrate. You run up the side of that building, right? And I say, okay, cool. There's some opportunity, there's some chance that will not succeed. So the mechanic that you will use for this is this move, Act with Intent. So you would roll, and in Powered by the Apocalypse, which May I Enter is a Powered by the Apocalypse game, that's a mechanical framework for building a game. You would roll that, and then you would determine what your ultimate success on that roll is. And that will tell you, that it will help provide elements to the fiction. So that again, is a type of mechanic. A mechanic can also be, hey, when you pick up a object in the game, X, Y, and Z occurs, right? For example, players may find gold in a dungeon while they are exploring the story in your game, right? Picking up a piece of gold may have a specific mechanic tied to it. That mechanic may be called experience points, right? It may be called resource management. It may not have a name per se, but picking up gold is an action that in lots of games has a mechanic tied to it, right? In traditional old school Renaissance games, in early D&D, picking up gold equaled experience points. And experience points help you make your character better at a thing. Making your character better at a thing has its own series of mechanics in almost every game that has progression in it, right? Progression is a mechanic. The idea that you as a character start in a very specific space, right? You are not necessarily good at a thing. You want to become better at a thing. So experience points, progression is the larger mechanical name for things that experience points falls under. Progression is a mechanic. Experience points are a type of progression mechanic, right? Picking up gold, again, has the effect of creating experience points that allow you to progress your character. Some games use progression in very different ways, right? One of the more interesting ways, one of the ways we use it in May I Enter, is story beats, right? You are trying to create certain story outcomes, story effects, story reactions, right? Things in the story that cause tension, that increase drama, that help the story progress, right? These sorts of things are called story beats, and they're neutral, really, in the way that they are discussed. They can be good, bad, wonderful, terrible, right? None of that actually matters. What the outcome of the story beat is, you are just producing a reaction in the story. And you assign experience points to the production of story beats, right? You're saying to a player, getting your character involved in the story and doing things in the story helps produce a fun story for everyone at the table. You get experience points for helping to produce that effect. And then those experience points allow you to do progression. I went 23 minutes without taking a drink of water. That's pretty impressive on my account. Okay. So we've talked about randomizers. We've talked about progression. We've talked about the idea of mechanics as action, right? Mechanics are things that you do to produce action in the world. But there are other places where mechanics are, right? There's lots of mechanics in story creation or character creation, right? During character creation, a mechanic is frequently a way of helping you craft your particular character, right? A mechanic within character creation has lots of downstream effects on the way people play the game. In general, mechanics help you tell the specific story you are trying to get your players to experience, right? Your game masters to experience, whomever, you are trying to create that specific sort of story. A wonderful example of this is Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, while a fun system, it is designed inherently to be a miniature war game, right? That is the original design of D&D, was an extension of the miniature wargaming that people were doing in the late 70s. This is not intended to be a disparaging comment, right? Dungeons and Dragons has gained a lot of mechanics that help tell different stories within it over the years, but at its core, that is the intent, right? A Powered by the Apocalypse game, like Apocalypse World or May I Enter, the goal is to tell a specific story about the characters. That is the goal of the mechanics, right? Apocalypse World is about telling a story about living in a post-apocalyptic world and the choices you have to make as a person in this post-apocalyptic world, right? And that's awesome, right? That means that all mechanics are driven to that, but they may not succeed. Not every game, even great games, not every game has the perfect mechanics. No game. No game has the perfect mechanics, right? 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. Amazing solo RPG. It's a great game. It has very few mechanics. So it's going to fail to do certain things. And that's not, again, it's not disparaging to say that, right? Its mechanics are story prompts. They are story prompts, and that's a type of mechanic. A story prompt is a sentence that says, well, what if this were to occur, right? And a story prompt giving you that jumping off point is a key component of solo RPGs. Story prompts are kicks, right? They're pushes to help you think about a story. You can build those into non-solo RPGs, right? But what 1,000-Year-Old Vampire will never do is it will never have a random moment that you are not somewhat in control of. Regardless of how you play 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, because it is built on story prompts, you will ultimately have to, as the player, make an active choice about an outcome. A dice randomizer causes you to have to make a choice that you didn't choose, right? A 1 on a D20 in D&D could be an epic failure, right? Depending on how you're playing the game. An epic failure is going to cause different impacts on the fiction than a 20 is, right? A 20 as a critical success is going to cause a different story outcome. So when you are creating these different things, that is really important for you understanding what they're going to cause, right? If you choose to have randomizers in your game, then you will automatically have the opportunity for, even though the players really want to succeed in the moment, when they expect to succeed because they are incredibly skilled, they are the best at the best, something holds them back. And because something holds them back, whatever that something is, it doesn't necessarily have to be, again, good or bad. That something holding them back will change the fiction. So when you're choosing mechanics, you have to think about success and failure and how that is going to impact the narrative. Because ultimately, mechanics for role-playing games are designed to help support a story, right? They are storytelling tools. And mechanics can help you or hinder you from telling a specific story. And if you are really rigidly trying to get players to play a very specific story, then your mechanics are going to be replicative of that, right? They're going to reference that in some way. They are going to be limiters, but they're also an opportunity for reducing limitations, depending on how you build them. Let's use an interesting game as an example, right? Eat the Reich is a game where you play vampires dropped into Berlin during World War II, where they are going to try and kill Hitler, right? That's a really interesting story concept, right? Vampires going into this very specific place and trying to do something. The mechanics for that game are designed to tell that story. Those mechanics probably are not going to work well to tell a different story, right? You can build mechanics to tell a bunch of different stories. There are a lot of different systems out there that claim to be universal role-playing game systems. Savage Worlds is an example of this. GURPS is an example of this. There are basic role-playing is an example of that. There are dozens. D20 kind of purports that it's capable of being a universal game engine. The Year Zero engine is a system that claims to do this, right? And it's true. As long as you bespoke them to what you actually want your story to be. And that's important, right? I think one of the interesting things about Savage Worlds, for example, is it has different traits that you take, different traits that you use to build. We had started with character creation. I'm kind of going back to that, right? As you're building your character, those choices you have in character creation let you have flexibility in the type of character that you're building. If your game master, if your GM, if your narrator, whatever you want to call them, is running a Wild West game, and you make a character that casts spells, that may not fit what they're looking to run, right? What you're looking to play. But Savage Worlds allows that flexibility because they know that they are an engine that can be used to do different games. But not every character works in the particular genre that you're looking to build, right? So character creation as a series of mechanics allows you or limits you in creating a character that fits the genre of the story being told. For example, Vampire the Masquerade, right? In character creation, you are given several clans that you have to choose from. The particular clan you choose gives you access to certain disciplines or powers that you have. These also have restrictions and negatives attached to them based on the character class, quote unquote, or the clan that you choose, right? That is a mechanic. Those are mechanics, right? Those are restrictions that give you options within them, right? A character class in D&D is the same way. You're playing a fighter, but not every fighter is the same. A fighter has a selection of different things that they get to choose from that help them craft their particular character. Again, these are all mechanics that I'm lumping under character creation. And then they have different names depending on the type of system that you are using to build them. But those character creation mechanics also then have long-term impacts on the particular story that you're telling, right? Or the particular story that you're running. If you have character creation mechanics that give you specific dice, either additional dice in a dice pool system, a modifier to the die roll that you're getting, whatever they do, those modification mechanics take the base rules and they adjust them in or against the favor of the player. I'm saying specific the player and not the character because our characters in this case, in my opinion, don't matter, right? They only matter in that they are engaged in a story that we are helping to tell for them, right? A character in the world may hate the fact that they failed a thing, right? They may be an absolute expert in that and they are just furious that they have failed at this thing that they're an expert at. But that happens. That happens in real life, right? And if you want to simulate that possibility, you would include some form of randomizer or limiter or thing that causes that possibility of failure to exist for them. I might make a super science character, a character who is a genius in quantum mechanics, right? And I am playing in Star Trek Adventures, which is a fantastic game. And I roll a 20. I'm just trying to get my numbers right. I roll a 20 on my dice. right? I have 5 d20s. I roll 5 20s. Now, that is incredibly unlikely, like mathematically, but it's possible, right? It's not impossible. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible, right? I roll so poorly that even though I'm an expert, there's something in the world that limits me. But I, in character creation, touching back on character creation, I, in character creation, took a specific talent, a specific ability, a specific thing. There are lots of names for these things. I took a thing that gives me the opportunity for a reaction to bad rolls, right? And that thing allows me to spend a different point, a different resource. We'll talk about resource management in here in a second. A specific resource to re-roll all those dice. And then I get 5 1s, right? Which is an absolutely mathematically improbable thing to get 5 20s and then 5 1s. Again, not impossible, but that completely removes that story failure that would have otherwise occurred, right? It allows outside of the game for there to be tension that the players experience. And that tension may be something you want to intentionally create, right? Where, oh, dang, we have had a really bad roll. That tension has now ratcheted up everyone's engagement in the play of the game. And that engagement turns around into an action that becomes an amazing success, which again builds investment. It builds engagement in the game. And often that's something you're trying to do, right? That's why you allow for particularly bad rolls or particularly good rolls, because you're trying to build in this intentional tension, right? This intentional tension that builds engagement, that gets the players to want to play again, or that gets the players to really embrace the game in a deeper way. That's the purpose of critical successes and critical failures, is to build tension. Now, if players are getting critical failure after critical failure after critical failure, some players are not going to like that. And so building a way out, right? Building a resource that you can manage to get yourself out of that can be really helpful for players who get stuck in a dice trap. And a dice trap is what I mean when a randomizer becomes something you cannot escape, right? A randomizer is just this sense that you are perpetually stuck in rolling bad dice. And it is good to have resources that allow players to feel like they can get out of that dice trap. So let's talk about resources. Resources is, and resource management is a larger term for mechanics that are about, I'm trying to think of the right word for it. They're all managing. I guess management is the mechanic, right? You're trying to manage and control and understand how this resource is being utilized. And the reason for that is often going to be some sort of story impact that you're trying to produce, right? You can have a resource that is designed to reduce dice traps. That mechanic can be inspiration, it can be advantage, it can be numerous other names for mechanics, but they are a resource, a limited resource that you give players and say, hey, this is your opportunity for a reroll. You have rolled really badly. You don't want that to exist in the fiction of the game. So I'm going to give you this resource to change that, right? To flip the script and make things so that you are actively able to engage with the world in a more interesting story way to you, right? So the resource that you are controlling there allows you to avoid the dice trap situation. A different resource can be items, right? Can be things that your characters have access to. This is a fairly traditional, old school Renaissance D&D, basic D&D sort of thing, right? Knowing what is in your backpack is incredibly important. You are in a isolated location. You can only have a certain amount of things with you, right? Shadow Dark is an amazing example of a game that does this. Shadow Dark says you only have 10 adjusted. You have 10 resource slots, right? You can only carry 10 things. And that's really interesting for a lot of players, right? Because they say, okay, I can only carry 10 things. What are the 10 things I need to carry to make sure that I'm successful? What are the other things my other player characters in the party are carrying so we can all share that responsibility together? We can balance everyone's needs, right? So that resource becomes a key mechanic. Some games deal with resources, items, as a resource management mechanic totally differently. Honestly, the large majority of people who play the current edition of Dungeons and Dragons don't care about resource management, right? Resource management for a 5e player is much more about the powers you can use every long rest and short rest than it is about the items that you're carrying. But they're still a resource, right? The abilities you have that have a limited amount of usage between a long rest and between a short rest is a resource, right? 4th edition D&D had these resources work on a system that was somewhat akin to a MMORPG. I can say that word, MMORPG, right? But they're in 5e too, right? Your limited resources, your limited ability to do a specific attack or magic or something like that in a day or between long rests is the same thing mechanically, right? You're just calling it something different because it feels different. And feel, I promise you, feel is just as important as the real mechanic behind a thing. Feel is actually probably more important long term than the actual mechanic effect for the majority of players. I probably will do a whole separate conversation about feel, right? Creating the right feel of the game. But again, mechanics are designed to produce feel. They're trying to produce a specific effect. Resource management can be done in so many different ways, and it's probably one of the more important parts of mechanical design, right? It's deciding what resources are limited. Are re-rolls limited in your game? If re-rolls are limited, then there are only so many times a player can get out of a dice trap. Only so many times they can shift the story in the way that they want to, right? That's okay. Some players will avoid using those resources, right? One of the fascinating things is in several games over the years, you give players resources and they hoard them. They hoard those resources and they never use them because the possibility of not having them when they really need them means that they refuse to. So there has to be a mechanic. There has to be encouragement to use those resources, right? This can be as simple as telling the GMs, award extra experience points to a player who uses all of their resources in a scene. The Trinity Continuum games use this really well, right? They give you momentum. Momentum is a resource that you can build up, and that allows you to do rerolls. It allows you to add extra dice. It allows you to do different things to control the scene, right? To cause different effects in the fiction. When you use momentum a certain amount of times in a scene, you get extra experience points. And that extra experience points has a mechanic of increasing your ability to progress your character, right? Players love a thing like that that encourages them to use the resource. They often won't know why. They don't know why you're doing that as a game designer. They'll just be like, oh, if I do this, I get some benefit, right? But what you're doing is you're encouraging them to do the thing, right? You're encouraging them to use their powers. You're encouraging them to engage with the story as a greater thing, right? And that's the awesome thing about a resource mechanic. Is a resource mechanic allows you to either it allows you to craft the narrative in a specific way. Again, Shadow Dark says you have X amount of resources you can bring into your dungeon with you. And by limiting the amount of resources you can bring into that specific dungeon with you means that you'll have times when you will not have the thing you need. Maybe one of the other players will have the thing you need, and that's cool because then you're encouraging player interaction with their characters where they choose in the fiction to work with one another. Or you have to be clever and think of a different thing that you were not thinking of before to pick up the slack on that lack of an item. In a similar sort of way, resource management wise, one of my favorite games is Pugmire. The original Pugmire and Monarchies of Mao, you have your rucksack. And a rucksack is a backpack, right? But it is also the fiction space where your items live. And you may have the thing you need, right? But depending on the rarity of the thing that you need, you have to roll a specific d20 to see if you have that, right? And this is an interesting resource mechanic that kind of lives in the middle space of these sort of resource management mechanics, where there are resource management mechanics that are more about limiting or encouraging creative problem solving in the scenario. But sometimes it's good to have a mechanic that just says, you know what, you probably have a candle in your bag, right? And the rucksack mechanic says it is a DC 5 roll on a D20. You have to roll a 5 or better to have a candle in your bag. For a lot of people, that's all they want, right? They want to know that their clever thinking in the moment is just as important as their clever thinking in the past when they are packing their backpack, right? Now, it depends on the experience you're trying to produce. If you want your players to have to think ahead, have to plan ahead, then having a specific limited resource is great, right? D&D has carrying capacity limits. They say you can only carry X amount of weight of stuff. That's probably sensible, because if you're carrying around 300 longswords, that's one, ludicrous from any sort of realism perspective. But realism isn't the right word, right? There's a different word, verisimilitude, that is more important, right? The reality of the fakeness, right? Things have to feel like they are connected enough, that they're legitimate enough in the fiction to be appropriate. So let's see, we've talked about resource management as a mechanic. We've talked about randomizers as a mechanic. We've talked about character creation as a series of mechanics. We've talked about story beats. We've talked about progression as mechanics. There are tons of different ways to do all of these things, right? I saw an awesome randomizer the other weekend that was a spinny. It used a paperclip and a pencil to create a spinny dial, right? And the spinny dial had 8 different outcomes depending on where the paperclip ended. Fantastic randomizer, right? These types of randomizers, we need to try new randomizers, right? I think that's a fantastic idea. But dice are a great fallback randomizer because they work, right? The good thing with dice is they work, and they will probably always work depending on the type of game that you're trying to produce. So, mechanically, when you are designing your game, kind of the point of this game design series is I want you to think about when you're writing a game, when you're making your game, because you're going to do it. You're going to go write a game. You're going to go work on the game that you've been working on for ages. I'm telling you, please, you can do it. Go and do it. Finish the game. Um, think about the mechanics, right? Think about the story that you're trying to get the narrator and the players to play. And then choose mechanics that help drive that story. And if during playtesting, if during play you discover that a mechanic is working in opposition to the story that you're looking to create, then change it. Throw it out. Do not feel beholden to bad mechanics in the design perspective, right? You may sit down, right, and decide and think, I'm going to have a D20 based system, and I'm going to make it a social manipulation game. You may, I promise you, you may create the best D20 social manipulation game that's ever existed, and that's fantastic. Do that. But you'll be creating lots of mechanics in that to make it work, right? If you tried to use Dungeons and Dragons as your baseline for a social manipulation game, using those mechanics without adjusting them to make them work for that, I promise you, it's not going to work perfectly. It might work. If your players buy into it and just live with it and do the thing, they may make it occur, right? But it's not necessarily what the mechanics are designed for. So think about that. Think about what you want your players to do at the table. And when I say your players, I'm talking as a designer. All players who play your game are your players. Own that. Embrace that. Live in that energy, right? I encourage you. I welcome you to think about every player who's playing your game or will ever play it as your players. And then think about the experience you want to produce and how those mechanics help produce that experience. I think that's going to create awesome results for you. And I look forward to playing the game that you design based on that experience you're looking to create. And if you're looking to create a generic system that has the opportunity for lots of different experiences, think about ways that allow that flexibility to exist. There are multiple ways of getting there. I don't personally think any generic game system has ever perfectly worked to simulate all the different things. But that's okay. Maybe we will find one. And then I'll say, oh, I'm never playing another game system ever again because this one works for everything. I just think that's unlikely because I think experience building requires a lot of nuance and a lot of experimentation to get there. So I'm at the end of the hour period that I set aside to do this. My goal is to do one of these a day around noontime Eastern every day while the U.S. government is doing its thing. I will see you again on Monday because I won't be doing this tomorrow. But I will see you on Monday, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful couple of days. And yeah, thank you very much for listening to this.